Chapter 8 of the A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by James K. White. The A.E.F. with General Pershing and the American Forces by Heywood Broun. Chapter 8. Men with Medals. General Pétain was the first of many famous Frenchmen who came to see the American troops in training. He also had the additional object of reviewing the chasseurs and of distributing medals, for this crack division had been withdrawn from one of the most active sectors to instruct the doughboys. General Pershing accompanied Pétain. The Blue Devils were drawn up in formation in the middle of a big meadow cupped within hills. The 7 men who were to be honored stood in a line in front of the division. 6 were officers, and they awaited the pleasure of the general with their swords held at attention. The 7th man, who stood at the right of the little line, was an old sergeant with a great flowing gray and white mustache. The rifle which he held in front of him overstopped him by at least a foot. The ceremony began with a fanfare by the trumpeters. As the last notes came tumbling back from the hills, Pétain moved forward. We found that he was not so tall as Pershing, nor quite as straight. The French leader is also a little gray, and about his waist there is just a suggestion of the white man's burden. But he is soldierly for all that, and his eyes are marvelously keen and steady. His tailor deserved a decoration. The general wore only one medal, but that was as large as the badge of a country sheriff. It was a great silver shield hung about his neck, and indicated that he was a commander of the Legion of Honor. He stopped in front of the first officer in the little line, waiting to be honored, and spoke to him for a moment. Then he pinned a red ribbon on his coat, and kissed the man, first on the left cheek, and then on the right. The doughboys looked on in amazement. "Well, I'll be damned," said one under his breath. "It's true." 4 men received the red ribbons, but the other 3 were down only for the military medal, which is a high decoration but less esteemed than the Legion of Honor. No kisses went with the green and yellow ribbons of the military medal, but only handshakes. Pétain stopped in front of the old sergeant at the end of the line and looked at him for a minute without speaking. Then he called an orderly. "This man has 3 palms on his croix de guerre," said Pétain. Now, a palm means that soldier has been cited for conspicuous bravery in the report of the entire army. "The military medal is not enough for this man," continued Pétain. "Step forward," he said. The old sergeant trembled a little as he stood, a tiny solitary gray figure in front of the whole division. "Bring back the trumpets," Pétain commanded, and for the lone poilu the fanfare was sounded again. "I make you a chevalier of the Legion of Honor," said the commander-in-chief of the French army to the old sergeant, and after he had pinned the red ribbon to his breast, he added a hug to the conventional 2 kisses. The poilu moved back to the ranks steadily, but as soon as the general had turned his back, the sergeant pulled out his handkerchief and wept. The soldiers greeted their comrade with cheers and laughter. "Now," said Pétain, turning to Pershing, "let's take it easy for a little while. I've seen plenty of reviews." The French general walked across the space cleared for the review and began to talk with people in the fringe of spectators gathered around the edge of the meadow. He talked easily without any seeming condescension. "How are you, my little man?" he said, patting a boy on the head. "In what military class are you?" Encouraged by his father, the boy said that he was in the class of 1928. "Oh," said the general, "that's a long time off. We shall have beaten the Boches before then." Next it was a peasant girl who attracted his attention. "Where have you come from?" he inquired with as much apparent interest as if he were talking with a soldier just back from Berlin. "That was a long walk just to see soldiers," he said when the girl told him that she lived in a little village about 10 miles distant. "But we are glad to have you here," he added. And so he moved on down the line with handshakes for the grown-ups, pats on the head for little boys, and kisses for little girls. He turned back to his reviewing station then, and the French troops swept by with brave display. They were very smart and brisk, horse, foot, and artillery. But Pétain found a few things to criticize, although he mingled praise generously with censure. He told the officers to know their men and to get on such terms with them that the soldiers would not be afraid to speak freely. He told of reforms which he planned to introduce in the French army. He favored longer leaves from the front, he said, and better transportation for the poilus. "I shall have timetables made for the men on leave," he said. And then for an instant he became the shrewd French businessman rather than the dashing general. "I have figured out," he explained, "that the army can afford to sell these timetables for 5 sous. It wouldn't do to give them away. Nobody would value them then." A week later we had another visitor. French generals and all their resplendent aides clicked their heels together and stood at attention as this civilian passed by. He was a short, stoutish man in blue serge knickerbockers and a dark yachting cap. His tailor deserved no decoration, for this seemed a secondary sort of costume and headgear in a group loaded down with gold braid and valor medals. But their swords flashed for the man in the yachting cap, and a great general saw him into his car, for the stoutish visitor was the President of the French Republic. Generals Pétain and Pershing accompanied Poincaré in his car up to the drill ground. It was an American division which marched this morning. In fact, it was the same unit which had marched through the streets of the port only a few months before. They had grown browner and straighter since that day, and they looked taller. Group consciousness had dawned in them now. The only lack of discipline was shown by the mules. It must be admitted that the mule morale left much to be desired. Many were new to the task of dragging machine guns, and those that did not sulk tried to run away. Strong arms and stronger words prevailed upon them. "Remember," the driver would plead, "you have a part in making the world safe for democracy." And in a trice all the evil would flee from the eyes and the heels of the unruly animals. A number of bands helped to keep the men swinging into the face of a driving rain. The French officers who accompanied Pétain and Poincaré were somewhat surprised when one regiment went by to the tune of Tannenbaum, but General Pershing explained that it had been played in America for years under the name of Maryland, My Maryland. He had a harder task some minutes later when a band struck up a regimental hymn called Happy Heine, which borrows largely from Die Wacht am Rhein for its chorus. As soon as the troops marched by, General Pershing sent orders for all the officers to assemble. They gathered in a great half-circle before the French president, who spoke to them slowly and with much earnestness. Indeed, he spoke so slowly that fair scholars could follow his discourse. Even those who could grasp no more than such words as Lafayette and President Wilson and La Guerre listened with apparent interest. Monsieur Poincaré called attention to the fact that the day was the anniversary of the Battle of the Marne, and also the birthday of Lafayette. These days, he said, linked together the two nations which were making a common cause in the struggle for civilization, and he ended with a dramatic sweep of his arm as he exclaimed, "Long live the free United States!" However, he called it Les États-Unis, which made it more difficult. "What did he say?" a group of doughboys asked a sergeant chauffeur who had been stationed near enough to hear the speech. "I didn't get it all," said the sergeant, "but it sounded a good deal like 'give 'em hell.'" The president and his party spent the rest of the afternoon inspecting the billets of the Americans. In one barn, Poincaré insisted on climbing up a ladder to see the quarters at close range, and as he climbed slowly and clumsily, It came to my mind that the presidential waistline, the knickerbockers, and the yachting cap were all symbols of the fact that France, even in war, was still a civil democracy. Still, it must be admitted that the next civilian we saw was more warlike than any of the soldiers. The only military equipment worn by Georges Clemenceau was a pair of leather puttees, which didn't quite fit, but he had eyes and eyebrows and a jaw which all combined to suggest pugnacity. He was not then premier, and indeed he had been in political retirement for some time, but he made a greater impression on the soldiers than any of our visitors because he spoke in English. It was on September 16, 1917, that Clemenceau saw American soldiers, but he had seen them once before, and that was in Richmond in 1864, when Grant marched into the city. Clemenceau was then a schoolteacher in America. The old Frenchman watched the sons and grandsons of those dead and gone fighters and expressed the wish that he might see American troops once again when they marched into Berlin. The doughboys he saw in France were not the seasoned troops which swung by him on those dusty Virginia roads so many years ago, but in their hands were new weapons which might have turned the tide at Bull Run and changed Gettysburg from victory into a rout. Certainly Pickett would have never swept up to the Union lines if there had been machine guns, such as those with which the rookies blistered the targets for the edification of the distinguished guests, and the bombs which sent the pebbles sky high might have given pause even to Stonewall Jackson. There were sports as well as military exercises in the program arranged for Clemenceau. There were foot races and a tug-of-war and boxing matches. In one of these, American blood was freely shed on French soil, for a middleweight against whom the tide of battle was turning butted his opponent and cut his forehead. I did not see Joffre when he paid a visit to the Army Zone and reviewed the troops, but he left a glamour for us all in our mess room, where he had dinner with General Pershing. It was a reporterless dinner, so it meant less to us than to Henriette, who served the dinner for the two generals. Nothing much had ever happened to Henriette before. She looked like Jeanne d'Arc, but the only voices she ever heard cried, "Il est chaud, Henriette," or hot water, or coufs, or eggs, and if they were not wanted right away, they must be had tout de suite. It was Henriette who brushed the boots and cleaned the dishes and swept the floors, and every night she waited on peasants and peddlers and reporters. Once she had a major in the Reserve Corps. He was attached to the quartermaster's department. But on the historic night, she stood at the right elbow of General Joffre and the left elbow of General Pershing. I was away at the time, and the correspondents were telling me about it before dinner. While we were talking, she came into the room with the roast veal, and I said, "Henriette, they tell me that while I was away you waited upon Marshal Joffre and General Pershing." One of the men at the table made a warning gesture, but it was too late. Henriette put the hot veal down to cool on a side table and pointed to the seat nearest the window. A large man from a press association sat there, but she looked through him and saw the hero of the Marne. "Maréchal Joffre là," said Henriette. She turned to a nearer seat and, pointing to the shrinking representative of the Chicago Tribune, explained, "General Pershing, ici." One of the men rose from the table then and got the veal. Something was said about fried potatoes, but Henriette remained to tell me about the historic dinner. She admitted that she was very nervous at first. That was increased by the fact that General Pershing ate none of his pickled snails. The Maréchal had 15. The soup went well, Henriette said, and General Pershing cheered her up enormously by his conduct with the mutton. The chicken was also a success. After the chicken, the generals held their glasses in the air and stood up. Henriette noticed that when Maréchal Joffre stood up, he was gros comme une maison. As he left the room, Maréchal Joffre pinched her cheek, but the mark was gone before she could show it to the cook. For all that, Henriette had something to show that she waited upon generals at the famous dinner. She opened a new locket, which she wore around her neck, and took out a small piece of gilt paper. She would not let me touch it, but when I looked closely, I saw that it had printed on it Romeo and Juliet. "It's the band off the cigar Pershing smoked at the dinner," explained one of the correspondents. Henriette put the treasure back in her locket and sighed. "Je suis très contente," she said. End of Chapter 8. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.